Hello, everyone. So this recording will be the remaining part of Chapter 5, looking at civil rights issues that involve groups beyond Black and white America. All right, throughout a good portion of this chapter, we can see that the issues were dealing with slavery and the aftermath of slavery and the process of trying to bring these former slaves into the area of citizenship in America. And we can see that this has led to a considerable struggle. But it's worth noting that when we look at the issues of civil rights, it certainly does go beyond just the struggles of Black America and the interactions with Blacks and whites in America. And so let's focus on some other issues there with civil rights. So clearly one of the big portions of the chapter deals with women's rights, the women's civil rights movement. And from pages 177 and 183, you can see the issues that are brought out there. The conference in Seneca Falls, New York, 1848 was really one of the first indications of this movement towards equality between men and women, women's rights in terms of voting, being able to own property, divorce, these kinds of areas. And so we can see that in the text, we look at ways of explaining, legitimizing discrimination against women, as you can see in the second bullet point. And really from the 1860s until the 19th Amendment in 1920, that is argument made on why women were not given the same rights as men is oftentimes referred to as protectionism, that women needed to be protected. And so as wives and mothers, for the good of society, it was legitimate to deny them the same opportunities as men in terms of education, politics, business, would not have the same opportunities. This starts to change somewhat with the 19th Amendment, at least politically. We start to see some changes that women would have the right to vote, as would men in 1920, 19th Amendment. So it's now over 100 years ago now, so not too many women that would be alive that would remember a time in which they would not have that opportunity to vote. And then you can see then opening up even more opportunities, in many ways focusing on academics and economics, to look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Equal Pay Act, equal pay for equal work. There could be other ways of circumventing that, perhaps, such as different titles for men, different ways of looking at the responsibilities for people that would have very similar jobs and then could justify, or at least try to justify, the argument on why the pay would not be the same. But this can lead to lawsuits and other ways of trying to use the government to bring about equal pay. To ensure that people are given opportunities to compete and to apply for jobs. You have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. My guess is most of you have filled out forms in which you've applied for a job and you've seen those initials EEOC on the form, that people are giving the opportunity to apply and to compete. Academically, there cannot be inequality among the genders if a institution of higher learning is receiving support from the state. And that's what we see there with Title IX. So Title IX is certainly put together in the early 1970s. That is one of the times of bringing about more opportunities for women in college sports. Oftentimes Title IX is used as a good example, but it was really overall for academic opportunities. If we continue to look into modern times, current times, we can see the Equal Rights Amendment, and it did not pass by the deadline of 1982, although there has been enough states now that have passed it. You'll see a really very thorough description of the status of ERA on page 182. And ultimately, your authors conclude that it will be up to the courts to determine the status there of the Equal Rights Amendment. Will there have to be a reapplication of it, or can you just stick with the number of states that have in fact approved it? So this is something which we could perhaps see the Equal Rights Amendment, or perhaps there'll be a continuation of this struggle. And on that issue, we'd look at Roe v. Wade and consider where does this fit with women's rights, women's equality? So it's one way to look at the act itself, the act of abortion, the procedure, and perhaps be opposed to that procedure, but then also is to consider the status of women's position in life and their equality if they did not have that opportunity. So how are women given equality if they're not in control of their own bodies? This becomes a major issue and one of the interpretations there of Roe v. Wade. And certainly then to look at the issue of sexual violence. It's also brought out in the Me Too movement, again, coming back to control over one's body and the issues then of determining equality in that arena and that way of looking at how we make that determination for equality. So certainly look over those issues roughly around the page of 182 there in your text. So then we also see for many groups is the issue of hate crimes. And so this is adding on the penalty when a crime has committed to look at the motivation of that crime. So should it matter, the motivation? So should some motivations lead to greater penalties? And if in fact there's an assault and two people have been assaulted in similar fashions and the outcome has been a broken leg and a broken rib, does it matter that one person was assaulted to get the wallet and the other person was assaulted because of their nationality? Should that make a difference? Well, hate crime arguments would be that it does make a difference. That one is, while both are bad, one leads to greater damage overall to society. And so that's a reason for having hate crimes. But here we can see, found directly there on page 184, the different categories in which you could see a motivation on committing a crime towards someone, at someone, because of these different areas. And that would then perhaps open up the possibility of additional punishment that would fit a hate crime. Now, a question here is, we can have in our discussions and then also in your notes, maybe write that down, maybe talk to someone else if you're in the online class. What behavior or behaviors in an act of a crime would indicate a hate crime? So if you have a prosecuting attorney that's making this claim and bringing someone to court on this issue, what would be the indicators that in fact this was a hate crime? So kind of think those over, what you would think if you were on a jury, that you would perhaps be more likely to conclude, yes, in fact, this appears to be a hate crime. Okay, we look here at Native Americans, pages 185 to 187. I'm sure there are people in this class that have a heritage here. And so you can think about some of the changes that have occurred, and certainly some of the changes that have occurred in the lifetimes of perhaps your grandparents are pretty amazing in some ways. So it's not that long ago. Think about women roughly over 100 years ago getting the right to vote. It's not even been 100 years now that Native Americans had citizenship. So there could have been citizenship given to some tribal members in some cases, but overall for individuals who were American Indian, did not get citizenship until 1924, which would mean they wouldn't have the right to vote, wouldn't have other kinds of benefits in that case. And we can see here the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, 1988. Indian tribes can open gaming operations on their property. And since this is now over 30 years ago, that in many ways we may not appreciate just what this has meant. I was a graduate student when this was coming out, and I remember sitting through seminars where you would have presenters say, this is major, this is going to be a huge issue. And I think we can see this in many ways. If we connect money to power in the United States, and I think in many ways we can start to see that Native Americans, or at least their tribes or some representatives of these tribes, have power. And they have the power through getting more money, and they get the money through the gaming. So gross revenue, this is directly from your text, 2018, 33.7 billion. So I don't think it's a coincidence, again, if you equate having money with power, that after that, we have seen changes in popular culture, sports. Two mascots are no longer there that were mascots of Native Americans. So you had Washington Redskins, don't exist, and the Cleveland Indians don't exist. So would that have happened without the economic power of American Indians? Well, we won't know, right? Because there's not an alternate universe where this gaming bill did not pass. We just know in this universe, the gaming bill passed and those teams' mascots no longer exist. So it is an example of political power. I would certainly say that it is in that case. So we can see the changes that have occurred there for Native Americans. Latin Americans, we can see some of the changes there. Look at the court case on pages 188, 189, Mendez v. Westminster. And so using the 14th Amendment in similar fashion to Brown versus Board of Education, amendment used to guarantee equal educational opportunities. And so if there was discrimination that was occurring or segregation, which we can certainly look at as a form of discrimination, a way to end that segregation is to interpret the 14th Amendment in a way to guarantee equal educational opportunities. We can see also some changes occurring for Asian Americans on pages 190 to 192, specifically for Japanese Americans. This is the one group of people that were interred during World War II. So they were in different camps and lost property and were treated in some way, well, certainly as prisoners. For what particular crimes? The crime was to be Japanese. And so in that case, the treatment for the Japanese was different than the treatment for Italian Americans and German Americans during World War II, which certainly, if it had been the same for those two groups, it wouldn't have been right either, but it would have at least not been discriminatory in that case to go after people who have a different race than the European-based Italians and Germans. And so reparations were carried out in a payment back to many of the Japanese American families in 1987. Now, that's an issue that, of course, is raised in our society today. Are there other groups that deserve reparations, some form of payment for what occurred to their elders or their ancestors? And so that's an issue that we won't really cover too much in this class, but you can imagine that in other higher level classes that deal with American society, American politics, you will certainly come across that term. And so here we can see the Citizens with Disabilities on page 192, comes back to Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So again, just to kind of think about my own experience. I started teaching here at a time where Shipley Hall, and some of you might be familiar with Shipley Hall, there was no elevator in the building. There was very few elevators on the campus, period. So we started to see some changes in that way to allow for people with disabilities to be able to participate, to be able to get their education. And a couple of the issues, though, raised about the American Disabilities Act, not all disabilities are covered. So there's a question on what exactly does need to be covered, and your text goes into some detail about are there other disabilities that should be brought up that are covered by Americans with Disabilities Act. And then reasonable accommodations are to be provided. So we have that debate some in our classrooms now. What is a reasonable accommodation that should be provided for people with disabilities? Not entirely able to resolve that, but certainly there are more opportunities for people with disabilities. Okay, well, one more discussion that we have here to wrap up chapter 5, and really wrap up the area there for our first test, chapters 1 through 5. Should it be guaranteed and protected? Should it be a guaranteed and protected right that every citizen get a mail-in ballot? So at the end of this chapter, they deal with opening up opportunities for voting. And so should those opportunities mean that it's not enough to say you have the right to vote, but to ensure that everyone will have a fairly open access to being able to vote by having that ballot mailed to them that they can fill out and mail back. So an interesting question there, and think about how you would answer that. And we may discuss that in class some. All right, so that's the end there of chapter 5. We'll be looking at political socialization in chapter 6 in our next recording. And so look for that sometime next week.